Our next guest speaker serves as the General Manager India and Vice President of Technical Services at Catchpoint. He comes with 10 plus years of experience in the application performance management space and has worked with over 1,500 clients across the world that has helped him become a trusted advisor and contributor for various teams at Catchpoint. In a few minutes from now, he's going to take us through his views on understanding the nuances behind the buzzwords DevOps, DevSecOps, and observability. With that, let's give our full attention to the one and only Mr. Nityanand Mehta.
Hi everyone, I'm Nit Mehta, VP of Tech Services at Catchpoint and GM of Catchpoint India. Um, Today we're going to be talking about the nuances behind the buzz around DevOps, DevSecOps, and observability. Now, Catchpoint, obviously being a monitoring company, we work with a lot of companies around the world with different teams, whether it's DevOps, operations, network engineers, SREs, and so on. And we have this advantage of getting this first-hand experience of organizations implementing these, and also some of those gaps around and the challenges that they experience. So what this is an effort where we bring all these learnings across different organizations that we've learned from over a period of time, and talk about where we are and where observability actually comes in around these two methodologies and concepts, right? So DevOps, DevSecOps, obviously the technology has evolved over a period of time. And there's a lot of nuances. While there is this buzz around these things, what often goes unnoticed are those nuances around these concepts. And everything, of course, has changed and will continue to change around these four things, right? Which is whether the applications that are being built by enterprises, by organizations, the infrastructure that they build that is leveraged for these applications. We've seen significant changes around infrastructure over the last 2 decades, particularly. Of course, the processes that are being deployed by organizations, and of course, the kind of skill sets that we've seen. In fact, DevOps itself is an outcome of these evolving requirements around skill sets, so on. So we'll talk about all of this. But while we've seen this transition over the last couple of decades, and particularly, there's one thing that has not changed, right? While we see all these changes, while we've seen everything moving towards everything as a service, one thing that has remained for organizations is delivering good customer experience, right? At the end of the day, whatever we do, we are here to ensure we deliver a business value to our customers. In turn, whatever the applications or services are, whether it's an e-commerce, whether it is a banking services, media, SaaS, what's the kind of experience we deliver to our customers, right? So all these different things put together is what it takes for us to deliver good customer experience. So when there are so many moving parts, so many different entities, so many variable factors, what does it take for delivering good customer experience, right? We always hear about team efforts and how it's about the culture and all of the other factors around it. But what really brings these teams together? Is there a way to measure? Is there a thing that really the teams work together, come together, irrespective of what their backgrounds are and what their teams are focusing on? And that one thing is obviously goals, KPIs, SLAs, SLOs, metrics, OKRs, as you name it, right? But I think the purpose of these is to bring all these as disparate entities together, to work together towards a single goal, which we spoke about was customer experience, right? And customer experience and a way of measuring that, whether it's the technology teams, the business teams, and all of that is where goals, KPIs, SLAs, SLOs come in, right? But the space where organizations struggle with is obviously how do you define these, right? And for that, it's really important to take a step back and understand what's really happening out there, right? So we'll spend a moment to talk about these changes, particularly on the infrastructure side. Like I said, over the last 2 decades in particular, where we've seen traditional data centers to a cloud, multi-cloud, and now the future of hybrid, where you talk about private cloud, traditional data centers, virtual private clouds, and of course the public clouds and so on. So we are already there. Organizations are already here where the most large enterprises around the world are on more of a hybrid setup, right? Which means which this brings up a new level of complexities for organizations. So that's something that we've seen on the infrastructure side. And of course, on the methodologies or the application itself, where we've seen one large monolithic applications to organizations moving towards microservices for more faster, more speed to the market, and it also at the same time provides more control. But like every other technology, there are challenges and there are opportunities that come with every new technology out there, right? So taking that further, of course, there are several other things, whether it is distributed computing, microservices, APIs, continuous deployment and deliveries, and so on. So there's a lot of changes that we've seen, whether it is the infrastructure, the methodologies that we deploy in building these applications, and so on. And of course, with organizations pushing changes, building new features, functionalities that they want to bring out to the users as soon as possible, DevOps is a thing that every organization has embraced, right? DevOps is a journey, DevOps is a culture, DevOps is a process, and it leverages multiple things, right? We've spoken about the advantages. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the advantages of DevOps and so on, but this is essentially a quick recap of what we've seen, right? And then, of course, with a lot of things that we spoke about has evolved on the infrastructure side, on the application side. Naturally, the security aspects have also evolved and changed, and organizations are required to adapt their security requirements, and it naturally becomes a part of the DevOps process, which is where we see DevSecOps being introduced, right? So I think we have another session from my peers at Catchpoint. We're going to talk about these tools and different scenarios. But this is more of a recap of what we've seen over the last a couple of decades. And why we're talking about all of this is to try and connect it where these changes, these practices, the different tools that are used by organizations. There are hundreds of tools which is used by DevOps organizations across all those different phases, whether it is building, testing, deploying, monitoring, and so on. And Catchpoint being a player in the monitoring space, we get to see what happens across all these things, right? So with all the changes, the evolution that we spoke about that has happened over a period of time, we are seeing a lot of new components being introduced to the mix between the end user and the actual application itself, which is hosted in different locations, like whether it's a multi-cloud or the hybrid model that we spoke about. And with organizations moving closer to the end users and users pretty much across the globe, right? So now DevSecOps also has to take into consideration what happens in the last mile, what happens in the internet transit, and also the several layers that comes in between, whether it is the DNS providers, the managed DNS providers, or it is your content distribution network and your WAF services that you leverage from different server providers, pretty much whether it is the Akamais of the world, or Cloudflare, anybody out there who provide a level 3 and a layer 7 and layer 3 protection for organizations. And of course, all the other third-party integrations that you use. So security is no more a thing where organizations is focusing on internal aspects that they use to control, but also they have to focus on all this distributed computing setup, the architecture and the services that they use from different organizations, which brings a new level of complexity around visibility and so on, right? So with all these changes, a lot of organizations lose control and visibility into a lot of components. So what this creates is a gap. And while we talk about the gap, again, we speak about DevOps as a culture where it's about shared ownership. This sounds great, but what we also see is where shared ownership breaks until an incident happens. And when an incident happens, what we see is mean time to innocence, obviously another buzzword, but it's a pretty interesting thing to look at because what we see in most organizations is when there is an incident, and if you've not adapted to the changes that the technology has gone through, there is a lot of finger pointing, right? So DevOps is great. It's a shared responsibility, shared ownership until an incident happens, and then there is finger pointing. At the end of the day, what gets impacted is your customer experience and your business results in turn, right? So let's take an example, which is a pretty popular one that happened sometime late 2019, where users who were leveraging AWS started seeing their services were not available. And this was a real incident where one of our major customers who's there in the digital entertainment space started seeing failures to the services that are served from one of their AWS endpoint in in the west coast of US, and we started seeing these failures. And the failures were in specific locations, like you see in the screenshot in San Francisco alone. And the failures were related to DNS and latency, request timing out, and so on. And we noticed that across North America, the end users were impacted where the services were not reachable, but it was mostly badly impacting West Coast. So we saw this, Catchpoint detected this, the customer got a notification, but this is where what we spoke about earlier started, right, which is a finger pointing, because uh, the logs and the monitoring that they had internally said everything was green, but then you have another solution that's triggering alerts saying there is a problem. And you also eventually started getting calls from customers, social media becoming active, detecting about an outage and so on. And here's what we noticed, right? So we noticed a user started seeing a problem, but 5 hours sooner than the service provider updating their status page that they have a problem, and eventually it took a few hours more to resolve the problem, right? And this is, and they were impacted because of DDoS attack that they experienced, and it took them. So there were early signals that we noticed, which we were able to help our customer detect. But the point that we're trying to discuss over here is about picking up those early signals and having that strategy as a part of your DevOps lifecycle, where you are able to detect these problems. And especially in scenarios like this, where you're using a third-party service and you don't have control over some of these things. So visibility really comes in. So with that example in mind, and for all those who are interested in looking at and learning more about this, I would highly recommend you take a look at this blog. It also has a video and so on. So that takes me to the crux of this conversation here today is more about APM and the concept of APM and the goals and some of those moving parts and gray areas that we'll try to highlight during this session. Two goals for any APM. There's a ton of solutions out there. Is detect and restore services. Obviously, the first one, how soon can you detect and restore? So that way, there's no business impact, end user experience is taken care. And then, of course, performance is a journey, like we say, so gradually improve all services, right? So for every layer, there are different tools that are there out at the market. So there's no real single tool that takes care of all the needs. But that's where the whole application performance management breakdown really comes in. And there's this often a confusion around application performance monitoring tool is equal to application performance management. No, right? It's a completely different thing. There's a lot of other moving parts in it, and APM is a component, or application performance monitoring tool is a part of it, right? So starting from the left, it involves security at every layer, and there are different dimensions, whether it is digital experience monitoring, focusing more on the end user side, synthetics and real user monitoring, focusing on external dependencies, network monitoring, internal network, APM, tracing and logging, and so on. Right. So there are different focus areas, and how do you bring all of this together is where observability and other components come in, which we'll talk about it in a moment. Right. So there are all of these moving parts. And there are different solutions that takes care of these needs. How do you bring all of this is together, right? And we'll talk about that. But going back to where we started, a lot has changed. What used to be everything under one roof is now distributed across multiple providers, hybrid models, edge computing, and so on. So the transformation of this technology really requires a new approach to looking at monitoring, right? It's more than bottom up, it's now top down because your end users are directly interacting with some of your edge services, which is pretty much distributed and you don't have much visibility or control, right? So the pyramid is inverted over a period of time, and this has happened with the changes that we've seen in technology. So with all these changes, and I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar or heard of Google's SRE book and the concepts and the SLIs and SLOs and so on. So I'm going to refrain from talking about SLIs and SLOs from an internal environment. I'm going to try and focus on tying this down to end users, right? So you've got those four signals. I'm not going to focus on that on the left side: latency, errors, traffic, saturation, which has obviously been condensed into three, grouped into three. Uh, of course, on servers, the physical state of your applications, whether it is the individual servers, server pool, apps, and so on. But it's more about how do you take these internal signals tied down to the experience that your end users get, and then in turn tie that down to the overall business goals, whether it is revenue, conversion, if it's a SaaS, more of adoption of the tool, or successful transactions, and so on, right? So the business KPI could be different for different verticals, but it boils down to how do you take this entire internal and tie it down to your user experience and internal to business goals, right? And user experience, like unlike on the internal side where you have four strong signals, on the user experience side, there's a lot of moving factors, whether it is the way the application is built. Uh, so so I kind of define this as a very fuzzy concept because the end user interacts with an application, and every application is different, right? Unlike whether you are an e-commerce or whether you are a banking provider, if you're using a server, the signals around CPU memory, the memory, all those signals are pretty standard on the inside, and of course the latency between service calls and so on. But on the end user side, what you really look at to measure the end user experience may vary, right? So it's kind of fuzzy, and you have to carefully choose what metrics truly represent your end use and how do you tie it down to the internal and of course the business goals is kind of important. So it's really important that you go through this whole flow. Uh, so on the end user side, there's a lot of different things that we have seen around frameworks, whether it is single page applications, multi-page, and so on. So based on these, what metrics you actually choose may vary. So it's really important that you take this also into consideration while you pick the right metric for your end users. While you choose all this, there should be some kind of guiding factors or guiding pillars which can help you determine the right metrics. And every time you go through this exercise, and here's what I would recommend that you do, right? Which is ask yourself these four questions. Is the application or the whatever it is that you deliver for your end users, this is what the end user cares about, right? Is the application I'm accessing available? How soon does the app load or the page load? How soon can I interact with it, right? If the page, I can see it, but if I'm not able to interact, then it serves no purpose, right? And most importantly, am I able to complete the desired transaction? In case of an e-commerce, I buy and check out, whether it is checking the status of an order, in case of a bank, transacting, media, checking, playing a video or whatever, right? So is the end user able to perform the desired transaction? What are those metrics that help you measure that? And like I said, this varies from one organization to another. So while there are dozens of metrics out there which helps you measure end user, it's really important that you pick and choose which ones really answer those four questions And like I said, it depends on the framework and how you build these applications and so on. So once you've got that, and here's an example, assuming you've got a few metrics that you've picked, you go about in identifying what your service level indicators are, what should those values be. Again, this is a pretty common concept, so I'll refrain from getting into the details on how to determine the SLI metric values itself. But once you determine these important signals, which helps you understand the end user experience, you define those, you have your metrics, and then you go about in defining your SLOs, what window, and so on. But here's another thing, right, which is how do you move forward? At the end of the day, there is always room for improving. There is always, and there's this thing called performance is a journey. So you really want to have that goal that you could work towards, while at the same time you're taking care of your SLOs and so on. And that's where aspirational SLOs come in. This is even more important for an end user experience, especially where in the competitive space that we are in today, right? So for aspirational SLOs, benchmarking is a great exercise, right? While you can have aspirational SLOs for our internal services, internal signals, for the user experience, it just boils down to your competitors, right? Which is whether the industry leaders, or it is if you are an e-commerce, do you want to compare yourself with the best in the industry, right? Whether it's the Amazon or the Apple or anybody else, or also in industry leaders in some of these capabilities where they're constantly focusing on optimizing and adopting some of those optimization techniques. So benchmarking is a great exercise where you can either compare yourself against industry leaders or competitors. And finally, a focus on a maturity model, right? So this is more of something of an introspection kind of a material for organizations, right? Which is a tool is a tool. Every organization has various kinds of tools that you buy from the market, which takes care of multiple purposes, or you have different tools that all collectively take care of your overall monitoring strategy, whether it is the heartbeat, whether it is synthetics to check your user experience, or real user monitoring, or it is your network application monitoring, log analysis, or even if it's your APM and tracing and your security and event management solutions, right? So while the tools are capable of doing a bunch of things, the way these tools are adopted by organizations based on where they are at that point of time really kicks in. So it's important that you realize as an organization where you are with the tools that you have, what needs is it taking care of, and where do you want to progress, which phase you are in, so you can start defining goals from a maturity point of view, so you're always improving, not just in terms of your SLOs and SLIs. Automatically your SLOs and SLIs improve when you are moving through this maturity curve of your monitoring strategy, right? So there are different phases, more of a reference model, but it's so important for organizations to look at which phase you are in. So once you progress, and this whole thing about observability really comes in, where you are able to take down all these different signals that's coming from all these disparate entities, being able to tie it down to what that potential output is, whether it is your end user experience or whether it is your business goals. Um, that's where you have organizations have true observability, and anything above that or anything beyond that is obviously the promised land, right? So it's so important for organizations to introspect and look at where they are in their journey, and some questions that could help you in also not just which phase you are in, but how comprehensive is your adoption of each phase, so that and these questions could help you really address that, right? So I think this is where I would like to summarize what we kind of wanted to focus on, whether it is the changes that we've seen in the technology space, the methodologies around DevOps, DevSecOps, the importance of adapting with the practices around DevOps and DevSecOps, and staying aligned with your infrastructure and development practices, and then having this maturity model which helps you to kind of align yourself, introspect where you are, so you could start planning for how do you progress to the next phase is super important, right? And to finally conclude, like at the beginning of the call, I spoke about Catchpoint. We are a digital experience monitoring platform. We work with some of the about 400 plus customers around the world, the Googles of the world, eBay, Microsoft, and so on, and across the space, whether it is Capital One on the financial side, Fidelity. So we have a lot of customers around the world that leverage Catchpoint today for their monitoring needs, whether it is the employee experience, customer experience, or taking care of your digital services to ensure end users are able to access and you're delivering good experience. And we do this by working with different teams across an enterprise, whether it is IT ops, DevOps, SREs, corp IT, senior executives, business teams, product managers, and so on. So all these different personas utilize Catchpoint, all again to focus on delivering good customer experience. Thank you.